So my name's RJ Nowling. I'm actually an associate professor at a small school in Milwaukee called the Milwaukee School of Engineering. So we have about 3,000 students, mostly undergraduate programs with some master's programs. Our focus, we're polytechnic, so all of our majors are related to engineering. And so I'm a co-director of several graduate programs in machine learning, and I teach courses such as data science, but also ML production systems. And I had 4 years of industry experience as an ML engineer between my PhD and faculty position. And I've recently done some consulting work with Memphis, who's developing a sort of message streaming platform, data streaming platform. So I teach AI, but my focus is especially recently is on the ML production system. So when I was an engineer in industry, I worked on massive systems for ad click prediction with hundreds of millions of different cookies. And so one of the things that we realized is that, or at my university, is this knowledge is kind of specialized, and you learn it tribally. You go work under someone at a startup or another company doing this. And so my focus has been, how do I standardize this knowledge and package it in a format that's easily picked up by other people? I think one of the industry changes I've seen is, 4 or 5 years ago when I was doing this, it was mostly batch. And so we do a lot of sort of the back end, pre-compute a lot of things for our known users. And that's very computationally expensive. And it wasn't very amenable to, figuring out which users had updated data and which users didn't. So you ended up recomputing everything. It was expensive, very complicated pipelines, hard to maintain, hard to operate, hard to keep running. And now I love streaming because it allows us to do things like, we have some history for these, incoming data for these particular set of users. We can update just for those users the information we have and update our key value stores or whatever to use at prediction time. So the pipelines become a lot smaller in some ways because they only need to process the changes. And that makes them easier to manage and easier to implement. It makes the resources, in terms of cloud compute costs and stuff, easier to predict. And then the other side of that is we're seeing some of that incremental computation moving from the back end to the real time. So one of the other industry trends is, this is kind of what my talk was about, was not just, hey, let's pre-compute all of this information we need for the users because we don't want to store things when only 1% of our users are active users or something like that, or 10%. That's costly. So instead, how can we store information such as, say, the American Community Survey data like incomes and population size and stuff like that for zip codes that can be used across a wide range of objects. So it's much smaller and much more efficient to store. But then when you do the predictions in real time, you can pull those from the key value store and do your join online. And so you basically just assemble everything as late as possible in the process to avoid having to pre-compute it, which again reduces costs, and it also makes you more responsive, right? You can pull the latest data. And so you can make sure that, if you have new information about the user, that you incorporate that as quickly as possible. In terms of some of the talks I'm most interested in, there's a talk by Quine here about streaming graph. So I had some friends who tried to use graph databases in genomics, and it didn't work very well because the data sizes were just massive. And not in terms of like raw gigabytes per se, but just the number of very small records with a lot of interconnections. And so I'm very interested in how Quine, as a streaming graph engine, allows that incremental, again, that theme of incremental computation, allows us that incremental computation because I think it might make it more feasible instead of trying to do giant batch on graph. I was also very interested in the talk on converting a Scala pipeline to Rust. I don't personally use Rust, but I have some industry folks who I have connections with who do. and they're just amazed by like the operational efficiency of building systems in Rust. And so I'm kind of curious as to sort of going forward, as a technology we know it's great, how well will programmers and teams be able to adapt to it? It's known as kind of a hard language. And so I'm kind of curious as to how that's going to play out. So my favorite conferences tend to be conferences that I would say have like 200 or 300 people, because you get to actually meet people and talk to them, and you don't feel lost in the crowd. And Scale by the Bay, despite the name, has the appropriate scale of attendees, and they're all practitioners, right? It's not, most of the talks here are not necessarily a company talking about their product. That's an engineer talking about a problem they faced and how they solved that problem and their experiences. So as another engineer, I can take that and use that. Now, that isn't to say there isn't great representation here of companies and products. There are, but I love that they're talked about in a very practical way of, here's, as an engineer, what you care about. Here's how it can solve your problems. And so I just really enjoy the conversation and meeting. I've been able to run into people that I worked with in industry 4 or 5 years ago, who I haven't seen in 4 or 5 years. And so that's really cool.